Shalom. Let me get straight into this lesson. And I'm gonna be doing a commentary on this video. And if you don't stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. That's a saying. Let's get that real quick. 1 second, Salakia. Okay. Let's say the saying. It says, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything, means that a person needs core values and principles to have a stable moral compass and avoid being easily swayed by others. So this let's go here. So got some similar things right here. It said lack of conviction. Without a firm belief system, a person can easily be tossed back and forth by opinions of others. Vulnerability to influence. I want you to listen up to this. It says an individual without principles is more susceptible to being misled or manipulated by those who are more confident in their own ideas. So you've been under a spell, under witchcraft. And, that's why we see, I was looking at this guy 50 Cent, and, a ninja is handing out turkeys thinking he doing something good. But, you see all these so-called celebrities, they under this spell, it is what it is. But they'll say they believe in the Bible, say they're Christians, but they don't follow nothing in it. That's the crazy thing about it. So let me get into the scripture. I'm going to get into the commentary on this video. This is the book of Luke 8 and 17. State that there's nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. So all this miseducation that you've been given, and I did a lesson yesterday. I advise you to check it out.
We all know the story. It's a picture painted for us in soft.
Going into the psychology of why our people continuously go on this hamster wheel and celebrate these traditions. First off, they don't even know who they are. They are copycatting another man culture, the so-called white man. And as I was observing things today, you jakes are just you gone. And this doctrine is really to set you free. What it is to set you free from the traditions, the mindset, from the ways of this world, which would be the so-called white man world you've been indoctrinated on. So let me get into this video.
Autumnal colors from the time we're in kindergarten. Pilgrims with their tall, buckled hats and stoic Native Americans sitting down for a peaceful harvest feast. It's a foundational American image, a story of friendship and gratitude that we've been told our entire lives. But that story is a lie.
It's a lie.
And it's not just a...
And IGNORANCE.edom, the so-called white man, that's all he do. That's his special superpower, that he can lie and do deception like no other ethnicity. And that's why our people find themselves in Babylon, the sea of confusion. Let's keep going.
Simple oversimplification. It's a carefully constructed myth designed to hide a much darker and more complicated truth. The real story of Thanksgiving isn't one of peace, but of politics, plague, and a prelude to war. This is the dark history of Thanksgiving that America won't teach you. The version of Thanksgiving taught to most of us centers on one event, a 3-day harvest feast in 1621. We were told the struggling pilgrims, after surviving their first brutal winter, were taught how to farm the land by their new native friends. And as a gesture of goodwill, they invited the Wampanoag tribe to share their bounty. It's a heartwarming tale. But the reality is that this single isolated event has been plucked from its devastating context and polished into a national fairy tale.
Exactly.
The peace it supposedly represents was temporary. The friendship was a political calculation, and the gratitude it symbolizes masks a history of theft, massacre, and cultural destruction. To understand the truth of 1621, you first have to understand the world the pilgrims were stepping into. The land they called Plymouth was not an empty wilderness. It was Patuxet, a village of the Wampanoag Nation, who had inhabited the region for more than 12,000 years. But by the time the Mayflower dropped anchor in 1620, that world had already been shattered. Between 1616 and 1619, a catastrophic plague, likely...
And them was it wasn't no 12,000 years. So that was I forget the math on that, but yeah, that's when in Apocrypha, when the Northern Kingdom came to the Americas, and the so-called white man got that strong host. He gave you these names. He gave you these names in this literature that you repeat, and you say with authority. Like Indian, that's a made up thing. African is a made up thing. Black people is a made up thing. Hispanic people is a made up thing. Mexican people is a made up thing. Native American is a made up thing. So on and so Europeans is a made up thing. So by him creating words and using his literature and his words to trap you up and to keep you in confusion, that's how you're able to do the deception as well.
Likely brought by European ships, swept through the coastal tribes. This great dying was an apocalypse. Entire villages were wiped out, with some communities losing up to 90% of their people. The Pilgrims didn't find a wilderness, they found a graveyard. The fields they would later plant were only available because the generations of people who had tended them were dead. The Wampanoag, led by their chief, Usamequin, were in a fragile position, threatened by rival tribes who had been spared by the plague. He was a shrewd political leader facing a crisis. He needed allies. And then, a ship full of strange, starving, and desperate people landed on the shores of one of his abandoned villages. And one of the most mythologized figures of this era is Tisquantum, the man we know as Squanto. In the kid's story, he's a magical helper who appears, already fluent in English. His real story is one of unimaginable trauma. Tisquantum was from Patuxet. Years before the Pilgrims arrived, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually made his way to England, learned English, and managed to get back home.
And these weren't Pilgrims; these were the Edomites. Pilgrims was like a word that they put there to cause confusion so they can control the narrative.
Only to find his entire village gone. His help wasn't just simple kindness. It was the complex maneuvering of a survivor caught between two worlds, his own now lost forever. So, when some of the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims gathered in the autumn of 1621, it wasn't a spontaneous party. It was a diplomatic meeting, a strategic alliance born of mutual desperation. The main historical account comes from Pilgrim leader Edward Winslow. He writes that Usamequin arrived with some 90 men, that is nearly double the number of all the surviving Pilgrim men. This wasn't a casual dinner, it was a political summit and a clear display of power. The Wampanoag weren't invited in the way we think of a dinner guest. They showed up, armed, to check on the colonists they'd made a treaty with. The deer they contributed wasn't a potluck dish. It was a traditional diplomatic gift. This alliance was fragile and served the interests of both sides. The Pilgrims needed Wampanoag knowledge to survive. The Wampanoag needed the Pilgrims' firearms to re-establish their power. That peace of 1621 didn't last. It couldn't. The English colonists saw land as private property to be owned. As thousands of new settlers arrived, their towns pushed relentlessly into indigenous territories.
They call them settlers, but these are demons. You know what I'm saying? Edomites. 1 second. 1 second. Okay, so now can we get back into this?
The warmth of the 1621 feast quickly turned to hostility, and it wasn't long before that hostility exploded into war. The first major conflict was the Pequot War. In May 1637, English colonists surrounded the main Pequot village at Mystic and set it on fire. As hundreds of Pequot, mostly women, children, and the elderly, tried to flee, they were shot or forced back into the flames. In under an hour, up to 700 people were killed. Following this victory, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared an official Day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the safe return of the soldiers.
Did you hear that? So that's what you're celebrating. You know, I'm just saying the people that's outside the truth. But they so stupid. You tell them this history and they don't care. They'll tell you they don't care. Well, they'll tell you in a roundabout way they don't care. It shows through their actions.
These days of thanks weren't about shared meals. They were celebrations of colonial conquest. Just one generation later, the peace with the Wampanoag themselves broke completely. Usamaquin's son, Metacom, known as King Philip, saw his people being stripped of their land and way of life. He formed an alliance of tribes in a last, desperate attempt to drive the English out. The resulting conflict, King Philip's War, was, in proportion to the population, arguably the deadliest war in American history. By the end, Metacom was dead, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. His wife and son were sold into slavery. The power of the region's indigenous peoples was broken forever. This was the true bloody harvest of the seeds planted in 1620. So how did we end up with the gentle story of pilgrims and natives sharing turkey? For that, we have to jump forward about 200 years. In the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln, urged on by editor Sarah Josepha Hale, declared Thanksgiving a national holiday to help unify a torn country. It was in this period that the story of the 1621 feast was resurrected and repurposed. The image of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a peaceful meal was the perfect origin myth for a country trying to heal itself.
You hear that?
It suggested
So it's all a propaganda piece, to put these enchantments in your mind. So, you see how people fully in folly. I went and, I did a lesson yesterday and showed you them psychology, because most people, it's a nostalgia. Nostalgia. Look the word up. And what it does, it triggers that, like that dopamine and all that receptors in your brain. So if you don't know this, you don't know how to combat this and come out of it. And that's why most grown-ups, you see grown-ass people, still like in a child state of mind when it comes to these holidays, you know what I'm saying? Because again, the psychology is really deep behind it. But you see how people, we're in the age of information age, and they dumb as they can possibly be. It's like we back at the before the internet was even invented, because Jake spent most of their time watching folly, watching prank videos, doing bullshit, entertaining, BS, and that's why they don't know anything. In the age of information, is crazy. You could literally look up anything and get any information in seconds, but our people have no interest in the truth. They just want to continue to do their folly uninterrupted, but that's not the way it's gonna be. Let's go here. It's like, let me pull something real quick. Give me 1 second. Information on my phone. It says the version people celebrate today is not the real history. Most Americans grow up hearing a myth. Pilgrims and Native Americans were friends, and they ate a big dinner together. Everyone lived happily ever after, but that's not true. This was created in the 1800s and the 1900s to build national unity, especially after the Civil War. As you went into that, it says the real history. It says the real events surrounding early Thanksgiving involved massacre of the indigenous tribes, land seizure by colonists are Edomites, backed by the church and government. So the Christian church, all your denominations participated in this. Modern day concept of Christianity is built on white supremacy, so-called. It says smallpox blankets, forced removal from ancestral lands, destruction of indigenous culture, language, and spiritual systems. It says, Salaki, I'm running out of time. But basically, you get it. He says people follow traditions they learn as kids, school celebrations, family gatherings, media and movies reinforcing the myth, pressure to conform socially. By adulthood, it becomes a habit, not a history lesson. You see family, comfort food, childhood memories, time off work, and they conveniently make you off, get you off work and get the kids out of school to kind of bait you into doing this. And you see this madness, man. I'm glad this shit over with. Move on to the next. Hopefully this lesson was edifying. Call Allah Yahweh Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rachak, Kodash. Shalom.